Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our Reviewer Credits webinars. You're all very, very welcome. And Nancy's here. Nancy, how are you doing? How's everything today? Are you well?
I am doing great, and I hope you are too, Gareth.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm doing very well. Thank you. Yeah, we're just going to give it a few minutes for all of our guests to join us in the webinar. I see people are streaming in. Do put your comments, do put your questions, do put any feedback that you'd like to give us over the course of this event into the Zoom chat or into the Zoom Q&A box. But it would be fantastic if you're joining us, you'd like to say, hello, I'm Gareth, I'm joining from Budapest. Just tell us where you're from, tell us what your goals are. We will be talking with Nancy, just getting started in a few moments, about all of the mysteries of writing a peer review report. I'm Gareth. I'm the academic director at Reviewer Credits. You can see this evening we're going to be talking this afternoon, this morning, depending upon your time zone, about how to easily write a peer review report. I'm joined by Nancy Vesta. Nancy, how are you? Everything's going absolutely fantastic. You're well this afternoon, this evening?
It is morning here, and I am well. Thank you.
Fantastic. We've got people from Spain, from the Philippines, from India, from Malaysia, from Uganda. I'm seeing people, wow, from all over the place. Absolutely great. From Pakistan, from Barcelona, from Iran, from Algeria, from Egypt, from Kalamazoo in Michigan. That's your neck of the woods there, Nancy. Fantastic. Great stuff. Really good to see so many people joining us today. Denmark, Ghana, Libya, Mexico. I will not be talking for very long. University of Nigeria, Washington, D.C. Absolutely brilliant. We do like to give everybody the chance to ask questions over the course of this event today. Do put your questions into the chat box. Birmingham, Virginia, Ethiopia, Tunisia. Absolutely fantastic. There'll be lots of time for questions as we come to the end of this event, but do feel free to put all of those questions and comments into the chat box. We are talking this afternoon, this evening, about writing an effective peer review report. And I'm joined for this event by an old friend of mine, one of the world's most experienced academic editors, Nancy Vesta. Nancy, will you give us a quick introduction? Tell us about yourself, please.
Thank you, Gareth. Yes, it's great to be here. As Gareth said, I've been editing for most of my adult life. Started quite by accident. I was waiting to go to graduate school and picked up a temporary job, and the editor at the correspondence course office at the University of Illinois fell ill. And my first degree was in communication, so I had taken all the writing courses at the university, almost all of them that were offered at the time. And so they asked me to help out. And anyway, I ended up editing like 10 or 12 correspondence courses, and I just loved it. But of course, I was going to graduate school, so I went to Kansas State. I got into my research field, which my research was on the epidermal growth factor receptor and its interaction with the ganglioside GM3 at the plasma membrane. If you're not a biologist, it's okay. You don't have to know what that means. And I decided I passed my prelims, but decided to take a master's because I really wanted to go back into editing. And so since that time, I have been editing all types of manuscripts, books. I've even done some copy for radio. I've done a lot of different things. If you've read it, I've probably edited something similar to it. White papers for, NGOs, books for teachers and for university professors. I've done editing and I've done all levels of editing: developmental editing, copy editing, language editing on scientific papers, which is probably where most of you are coming from today. In the past 5 years alone, I've edited about 3,000 cell and molecular biology papers. The previous 20 years, I had edited largely academic journal papers for higher education in the United States. So I've been around the block and I've seen a few things. And since I've done it for so long, I started out, everything was on paper, and we, corrected it in a red pen and sent it by mail. And then you know, everything had to go online, and there was a big panic about how are we going to get all these manuscripts online and make them accessible, and how are we going to process all that, and what's going to happen to print, and now it's AI. You know, well, how is AI going to change publishing? And what I've discovered is that the author pain points don't change through all these cataclysmic events. You know, the biggest problem is the lack of training program for researchers who are looking to publish in legitimate journals. And in terms of the process of publishing, one of the big choke points is the lack of reviewers, of peer reviewers who are qualified, willing, and trained to help keep out garbage manuscripts that shouldn't be put in the pipeline. So these manuscripts that are not particularly good, or either because the writing is poor or the design is poor, they end up clogging up the pipeline. And so peer reviewers have the awesome job of helping to clear that pipeline. And that's why I'm really excited today, because without that clearance, what happens when the publishing pipeline gets blocked up is that it opens the door for predatory journals, you know, who are preying on authors who need to be published quickly, and they're stuck in that bottleneck in the process. So I'm very excited to be here today, because we need peer reviewers to help get our research out there to the people that need it.
Fantastic. Well, I see that everybody's telling us a few things about themselves in the chat. We've got people from Malaysia. I saw friends from Munich, formerly from Hungary, like people from all over the place. Indonesia, I'm looking India, now Nigeria, just recent. So, wow, fantastic. Great to see everybody. Fantastic. Absolutely great. What our goal is with this event is to help you with a template, Kenya, to provide you with easy ways to write your next peer review report when you get invited by a journal to provide a peer review, which is what we're all about at Reviewer Credits, of course. So here's what you're going to learn about in this event today with Nancy and myself. A few things about the benefits of peer review, your considerations, things to think about before you agree to complete that next peer review. You might get an invitation, an email request. What should you do to decide whether or not you should take that on? Issues that journal editors want peer reviewers to address. What should you be thinking about when you accept a peer review for an international journal? What kinds of things are editors going to be expecting? And Nancy's going to give you, from her experience, a step-by-step process for evaluating a peer review report. And we're going to show you how you can write an effective evaluation as a format, how you can do that easily, and then some tips and tricks from our experience to help you become effective as a peer reviewer, because at the end of the day, peer review is often a bit of a nightmare for researchers around the world. But what it does, above all, as a process, is it filters and improves content. So we trust articles that have passed through the peer review process. We use them in our own research. We should be submitting our research papers to journals that use peer review, of course, but as peer reviewers, we're also active researchers. We are going to help journals around the world to filter and improve content. But as Nancy already mentioned, one of the key issues in this area are those fake journals, those journals that are asking us to do work for them with no reward or no recognition. Many open access journals can be fake, they can be predatory, they'll try to cheat you if you're an author out of your money, out of your research, and it's getting more and more difficult to spot these kinds of journals. So we're here at Reviewer Credits to provide a gateway between publishers and you reviewers. So if you sign up, and I'll put the links a little bit later into the chat for you, if you sign up as a reviewer on Reviewer Credits, you will be able to filter out those requests, because we only work with reputable publishers. We're only working with publishers who are signed up on our platform. You do work for a publisher as a peer reviewer, you get credits. You can then spend those credits in the Reviewer Credits Reward Center. Many ways to spot a fake journal. Look at the website, look at the indexing, look at the editorial board. Is it publishing regularly? Are the articles that the journal's publishing, are they properly peer reviewed? Any fees, of course, you should never be paying any fees to a journal before the paper gets fully accepted. And of course, no spam. So we're looking at ways to identify real journals. Are they listed? Is there a robust peer review process, which of course is what we're talking about in our event today? And are the fees and the policies fair and clearly listed, explained in detail? So you are a researcher. You have a great background in your research area. You're sitting there one day and you get an email from a publisher inviting you to do a peer review. And at this point, I'll hand over to Nancy, because how are you going to evaluate that peer review request? Where are the benefits to you as a researcher? That's what we're all about with these training sessions. How are you going to evaluate the benefits of peer review? Over to you, Nancy. Take it away.
Thank you, Gareth. Well, one of the things I failed to mention, I think, is in one of my positions throughout the last 30 years, I was involved in coordinating the communications from the editor to the reviewers, from the reviewers to the authors back to the reviewers. So I've seen, I probably did that for 5 or 6 years. So I've seen a lot of the areas that cause problems for reviewers. And so, but sometimes they don't always see the benefits, that they get. They lose track of that because it's such an onerous process. So in terms of what it does for the field, obviously it promotes the field. If we have good manuscripts that are out there, then we are advancing our own field of interest, which increases our own status in the academic environment. And probably the biggest way we help is we help colleagues acquire the corner of the realm, right? Everybody is looking to be published. And so by helping colleagues improve their work, we are helping them be accepted by high quality journals. And of course, the most practical reason is that we're contributing to the author's decision about publication. And editors are sometimes inundated with hundreds of manuscripts. They can't even read all of them at any depth. So they rely on peer reviewers to help them with a decision about whether to put that in the paper. And for you, the reviewer, there are very practical skills that you improve as well. Your own language skills, even if probably a lot of you are teachers, you've already, you're communicating with your coworkers, but when you look at how to improve a research paper, you become more, you have to analyze things in a depth that maybe you don't normally have to do. And so it improves your ability to approach your research paper and how to communicate your own results. And it gives you some strategies on how to write more focused and concise grant applications, because you actually have a lot more leeway in a manuscript than you do in some of these grant applications. So if you're improving your communication skills, if you're improving how to write research papers, by analyzing how other people are writing research papers and identifying problems and ways to fix them, you will become better yourself. And as I mentioned, it improves your own critical thinking skills. It increases the number of professional connections and opportunities you have. You can put it on a CV that you've been a peer reviewer. You can make connections through reviewer credits. And even if you're doing double-blind reviews, and you don't necessarily know the researchers you're working with, you do establish a way of speaking to people in your field that is invaluable. You might not know exactly who you are, but you're all interconnected. And at some point, you're going to bump into other peer reviewers and other people who've had papers peer reviewed at conferences, and it gives you a point of connection. And probably most important, it helps you stay abreast of what's new in the field. People are doing exciting things, and especially if you're given a multidisciplinary journal article to work on, you might learn some things that you weren't aware of before. It increases your confidence. You're being asked to be a reviewer because of your expertise. But sometimes it's it's hard to recognize your own expertise. You've been doing this for so long and building it. By being able to look at papers and seeing yourself going through that evaluation process, you tend to recognize your own expertise better. You start to get more confidence in what you can contribute. It helps with your communication skills because, as I mentioned before, you're forced to spend more attention to detail than maybe you do when you're normally just reading a manuscript. You start using professional language in a way that you might not always have to do. If you're speaking to students or speaking to graduate students, you're not always, even if it's in writing, you're not using the same tone, you're not expressing yourself the same way. So it gives you practice in using professional language in writing, and maybe in some ways in person. It gives you the confidence to speak with other professionals, even if you have a language barrier. And that helps develop a collegial attitude. You know, when you see what other authors are going through, you know, you can't help but feel for them because you've either been there or you will be going through that review process. So I think it helps develop, as we talked about before, those connections that are important to advancing the field and for helping each other. It helps with your data analysis as well, because let's face it, we all took statistics back in the day, but the only statistics that we use regularly are the ones we're most confident in. So, you know, you're going to have to kind of stretch a little bit and maybe go back and revisit some of those analyses, and or you're going to be better at identifying problems in the data that you see already, that you're familiar with. That practice will help you see problems more quickly, which leads to probably the most important benefit that you get is the ability to balance your assessment. You know, we think of peer reviewers as being critics of papers, but in fact, you also need to look at what's positive, because in the end, when you make a recommendation, you have to weigh whether the positives of the papers, the positive points of the paper outweigh the negative assessment that's certain to come, because nobody's perfect, right? And even a paper that's published, you know, is not perfect. So I think that's one of the long-term benefits that you get. And also your ability to maintain fairness. You know, the more manuscripts you see as someone with the responsibility of reviewing it, the more likely it is that you're going to start to be able to remove yourself from your own interests and see the papers for what they are. And that ultimately helps you in decision making. You can do all these things now. It's just you'll be better at them. You'll be quicker at identifying, making the decisions you need to make, because you'll have the experience of going through those analyses. So, okay, you're convinced you want to be a peer reviewer now. Should you accept every invitation you get? Well, probably not. So to help you hone out what you can do and what you don't have time to do, you want to make sure the paper is in your field of expertise. And there's a little caveat to that, because I mentioned multidisciplinary papers. You know, you may be the sole medical doctor looking at a paper written by biochemists. And so your perspective is important because it's a paper on doing some field analysis, and they need someone who's actually done those tests in the field to review the paper. So you can always talk to the editor that asked you and say, hey, you know, I can review this part of the paper pretty confidently, or is this what you're looking for? You know, we tend to think of it as a one-way street, and it's not. Talk to the editor and see if you're on the same page of what they're looking for, if you feel a little uncomfortable about reviewing a paper. But ultimately, you have to be able to obviously have the background to, you know, if your research is on, you know, fish, you probably are not going to want to do a paper on, you know, the advantages of academic advising in higher education. Might not be your area of expertise. So, and it happens where you might accidentally get a paper that you shouldn't have. You also have to look at conflicts of interests. And this goes back to, I talked about, you know, double blind review. If you're in a pretty niche field, you're going to know what lab this is from, or what, you know, what group is putting forth these ideas in a theoretical paper. And if you feel that you cannot assess it fairly because you've either worked with those researchers, or maybe you've, you know, you're in a conflicting lab, you're in a competing lab, you need to back away and explain the reason. probably the biggest stumbling block is, do you have time? And I know one of the questions is going to be, how much time does it take? And of course, the answer is it depends. A short paper that's well written can be a lot faster to review than a short paper that's a long paper that's well written can sometimes take less time than a short paper that's poorly written. So unfortunately, this is one of those things you kind of learn by experience, but there are a couple things to think about. You can think about, how long does it take you to generally read a manuscript typically, when you're just reading for your own benefit, kind of have an idea of what that is. And then that gives you a starting point. And we'll talk about that because we're going to do an initial read first. You have to consider that if the paper has to come back for another round of reviews, you may be asked to review it again. The second review is usually not as extensive, but if you're going to be, on a mountaintop somewhere on sabbatical and won't be available, you need to communicate that with the editor so that you might not be the best person to do it. Of course, you need, as Gareth said, you need to be able to recognize the journal, just like authors. You need to make sure that the journal's legit. You can use the same standards as you would use as an author, because you don't want to be associated, and certainly don't want to have your name associated with reviewing a predatory journal. A couple other less obvious things to think about. You have a responsibility for these reviews. So you want to make sure that your connection is secure, that your data is encrypted. So when you download portions of the manuscript or the whole manuscript, nobody can hack into that and take the author's data or your comments. And also you want to consider whether or not you are familiar with the content management system that the journal uses. I'm familiar with PeerTrack, for example. Almost all these have some learning curve involved. So you want to consider that when you're thinking about your time, and you want to consider how easy it is to learn and how easy it is for you to learn these things. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it if you don't know it. It's just you have to allot for that time on top of what you would think about, what you would consider if you have time for it. So you decided to do it. Now you need to know, what are they actually looking for? Because you've probably gotten some comments that you're like, this really wasn't that helpful. Your ultimate job is to help the editor. You're also going to help the authors, but this is what the editors are looking for. They're looking for whether the paper is relevant to the field. This is where your expertise comes in. They are looking for whether the argument is logical. And that doesn't just mean writing. That means, are the premises properly backed up with background information? Are the premises consistent with those of the field, or is it way out there and something that might be junk science or something? You want to look at the validity of the methods. Do they answer the research question? Is the research question obviously there? Is the hypothesis clearly stated? And do the methods answer the question or address the hypothesis? Do the data that are reported support the hypothesis or conclusion? In other words, are they reliable? Did they use the correct statistical analysis? Is their design appropriate? And finally, is the paper complete? That includes, do the authors discuss how the findings are relevant to the field? It also means that there are citations and that they are properly rendered. A big sticking point is any ethical violations. If you're doing animal experiments, are there review board licenses? Is that something that's required by the journal? And most likely it is. So you need to know not only what are the ethics for the field, but what are the specific ethical requirements that need to be stated in the paper. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And finally, is the article in the scope of the journal? Because it could be a fabulous article. And let's say it's an article on, whether a gene is expressed in a certain type of disease. And the paper's about the analysis of that gene expression under certain conditions. But the journal is primarily geared to medical practices, practical, we're looking at whether these clinical trials, whether these cohorts are benefit from some therapy. It's relevant if the idea that you're putting forth information about a disease and what causes it is relevant to the field. but it might not be in the focus of the journal. Another thing to think about though too is it might be along in the journal, but in a different section. Like it may not be a research article, but it could be a communication article. So those are, you have to kind of be familiar with, you don't have to know it inside and out, but you need to know what the focus of the journal is and make sure that the article fits the focus of the mission. So now comes the fun part. You know what you're doing. You've decided to do it. Now you got to do it. So I recommend that you read the paper just as you would read it if it were in a journal. You open up the paper on your computer, or if you printed it out, and you read it in the same manner that you would read a research article in that journal. So if you're kind of a person that looks at the introduction, looks at the tables and the figures, and kind of glances through the introduction and breezes through the methods, that's fine. You're going to get a general impression, just like you always do, about the paper. And a couple things that you want to kind of think about is whether or not the abstract accurately reflected the paper. And you're going to do that by writing out a summary of what you read in the paper. So you're going to write about what the premise was. You're going to discuss what the theories and the methods that were used. You're going to look at the results, and you're going to evaluate whether they are important or novel. So 4 or 5 sentences, just like you're writing the abstract. And that's where I'm getting at. That's going to help you evaluate whether their abstract seems to reflect the paper. It also acts as a template for you to go back when you're going more in depth in your analysis. If you end up spending a lot of time in the method, you can go back and say, oh yeah, I need to look at that premise again and make sure it's like I thought it was. It also helps you identify how much time the paper is going to take. You're going to assess whether the paper is pretty roughly written. And it's also going to help you determine what part of the paper you're going to spend the most time on. So you've read it in your normal manner. These are some of the things that you might want to put down in terms of general notes. Don't even have to be full sentences. Are the findings relevant? Was the research question clear? Do you understand what they're asking or what they're looking into? Are there ethics issues? If there's potential ethics issues, can they be addressed? Or do they disqualify the paper? And what I mean by can they be addressed, sometimes researchers have indeed gotten the permissions from the proper authorities to run experiments, but they forget to put it in the paper. It may actually be in the content management system. So it doesn't necessarily disqualify them if it looks like the experiments were done ethically. You might, that's obviously a clear question to ask in a resubmit request. Do the methods answer the question? Kind of gone over that. Is it clear? I mean, if the argument is doesn't match the premise, then there may be a bigger problem that needs to be addressed. Again, is the documentation complete? And or can the authors just kind of supplement? Let's face it, sometimes papers have been, the literature review was done 3 years ago when they started the research. Is it just a matter of they need to update some updated information, or can they add raw data that maybe they left out, or is big chunks missing that need to be added, and therefore rejection is likely. You also, again, going back to, is it consistent with the mission? If it's not, you might want to still write some notes to the authors so that they can use those to resubmit to another journal. And again, I kind of mentioned this, you might consider whether or not sometimes in these content management systems, you have to check a box of what kind of manuscript you have. And it's really easy to check the wrong box. So it might've been routed to you as a research article when in fact it's something else, like a toolbox article or something. So you want to make sure that you've, evaluated that before outright rejecting it. And again, going back to the abstract, can it be revised? If the abstract's on hummingbirds and the paper's on flowers, we've got a bigger problem. If it's a matter of the journal likes the abstracts to be defined with a method, the word method, and then the methods listed, and the word research and research method, but the abstracts in an article in paragraph form, that's something that's going to have to be corrected. But if the abstract makes sense and it reflects the paper, then it's probably not a paper you're going to reject based on that. So again, you're going to look to see if the article can be resubmitted as a different type of article before you outright reject. So if we don't have any major problems and we're probably looking at some sort of revision, resubmission, maybe an accept with some revision, but we're gonna continue this discussion as if you're doing a resubmission. So you're going to go back over the manuscript in more detail, and you're going to ask very specific questions to try to identify the problems that need to be corrected and offer general suggestions. So to do that, you're going to make specific notes, and that includes the paragraph and sentence number, or if you're doing it online or doing it on the computer in something like Word, you want to make sure that you highlight. This is just a suggestion. This is not, make or break kind of thing, but you'll find it a lot easier if you highlight the entire sentence that's in question or the entire passage. That way you can just, when you go to make suggestions for the authors, you can just copy and paste. You don't have to go back and try to figure out where the beginning and end was, but you want to make those notes, make comments in the margins or on paper, whichever you're more comfortable with. And you're going to start, of course, with the introduction. We talked about the premises. Are they consistent with the field? If it's unclear, there's a couple things to look for in terms of whether or not it's an egregious error or one that can be corrected. If the paragraphs are disjointed and all over the place, but generally it flows from the big problem to the research question, that's a writing issue. And your comments might be something like, reorganization of the introduction is needed before it can be accepted. I recommend that you contact a developmental editor to help you, because, writing is thinking it in the proper order the first time you write something is sometimes very difficult. And especially if you have multiple authors, even if it started out okay, in the end, it can look pretty cattywampus. So you might evaluate whether it's rewriting or whether there's just the background information they presented is not analyzed correctly. They're referring to a theorist from the 17th century, and they're misinterpreting what the field tends to think that theorist is saying. So this is an analysis problem that probably means there's a likelihood that it may be rejected now that you've looked into it a little bit better. This kind of goes back to those skills we talked about. It's not just, this manuscript was difficult to read and I didn't understand it. You start delving into what exactly is wrong. Is it how it's written, or is it the actual ideas that are wrong? And that's really valuable, even for yourself when you're looking at your own writing later, right? The methods and the results. This can be a little tricky because you almost have to consider them together. Every result should have a method associated with it, right? So you want to make sure it's that those two sections are complete and together, that they're tied together. Generally, it's easiest if all the methods are listed and then the results are listed in the same order, but that doesn't always happen, and that'll be up to you to try to figure out that all the methods are indeed there, that they address the question, and that they're described properly. And this would mean, like, you get into the results section and you're reading the comparisons, but you don't understand what groups are being prepared. The problem is actually in the methods section. They should have identified and described their groups, their controls there. So if you're finding the problem in the research section, that's may not be where the problem is. The problem is they didn't identify those things in the methods. That's why they kind of have to be evaluated together. But there are specific things that would be missing in a method section. If the paper's on gene expression and there's no PCR data, then you obviously something's missing. Are the data reported in full? So are the statistical data presented? Are the p-values there? Are they clear? So when you look at a table and figure, is it just repeating everything that's in the text? It's probably not necessary. A figure should summarize everything that's in the text. A table should be very specific about the information that's generalized in the text, but they shouldn't be completely repetitive, right? They should be in the appropriate order, and they should be able to, the figures and table should be able to stand alone. You should be able to look at that and understand what data you're looking at, what process you're looking at. It should be labeled correctly. You want to evaluate if they're professionally prepared, if they need a designer, they need, help with their finished product, that needs to be stated so that, again, the author guidelines often are very specific about, pixels and those kind of design elements that have to be their size. And you can refer them back to that, but that is a point you want to make in your analysis. And I think I talked about other statistics properly applied. Again, that would be in the methods section and reported properly in the results section. So you want to, one of the points we talked at the editor wants to know is if the overall argument of the paper is good. And so it doesn't sound, it's not intuitive that really comes down to the discussion, because in a lot of discussions, it becomes kind of the dumping ground for all the information that the authors didn't know where else to put it. Sometimes it's just a summary of what they did and saying, we're really happy with our results, essentially. But it really should be more than that. The discussion should tie in the premise, and the same premise that was stated explicitly in the introduction should be restated in the discussion. The hypothesis or the research question should be restated. The results and how the authors came to those results should be summarized. But the discussion should also place the argument in the field, place the paper in the field. So that means comparing it to literature that's already out there. The author should have done a compare and contrast, or explained what gap in information has been filled, what problem has been resolved, and how their data resolves it. One of the sections I have often seen missing in papers is a limitations section, whether that's listed as limitations or a paragraph describing, hey, we can't make generalizations on this paper because we only used, one cohort from one department in one college, that needs to be, those elements make the argument complete. And now you're going to go back. You've got a full sense of the paper, what it's about, what the point was, what the relevance is. It's time to go back to the title. Is the main point in the title, are the results stated in the title? And does the abstract follow the paper? And does the abstract follow that initial summary that you wrote in the beginning? Because that's going to help you tie all your thoughts together. So is the premise and the background stated? Is every result stated in the abstract? Is there a method associated with it? Are the results actually stated and not alluded to? We found that 40% of this group of people did not respond to this treatment. That should be in the abstract. And is the importance of the field indicated? And sometimes if it's a really basic research, sometimes even putting in, we think that, like it's a pilot study, we think that our results can allow us to look at a more in-depth or more significant problem. Okay, so what have you done? You've read the paper once and written a summary. You have general notes on your impressions of the paper. Now you have very specific notes, either in your comments or on paper, so that you can identify quickly where it's at in the paper, what, if it's in the results, what paragraph it's in, what sentence it's in. That's going to be important later. You're going to polish up those notes that you initially took, because you're going to start your report with something like, I read the following paper on, and then you're going to list the paragraph describing the paper. I would recommend, if you can, find at least 3 good points of the paper. Really interesting research question. Really tackled it in an unusual way. The experiments were consistent with what we would expect in a paper like this. Those are all positive things that you can say, because both the author and the editor know that the but is coming, right? The critical parts of the paper that maybe need improvement. And you want to summarize those problems that led to the decision. Not all the problems in the paper, but the problems that led to the decision that you made. The premise was not supported by adequate background information, or the results are reported, but there's no method articulated for that result. For these reasons, I am going to recommend that the author revise and resubmit. So you've stated why the paper is good, why it's relevant, what's great about it, but it needs more work, and this is what I recommend. Okay, so that you want to be very clear about what you're recommending, because sometimes it's not. It's like, well, I found all these problems, and you're still kind of leaving it to the editor to do that weighing that they've kind of asked you to do, right? So going back to the skills that you learn, how do you weigh a paper? How do you weigh the pros and cons to decide? And unfortunately, that does come with experience. Well, you can do it now, but you'll get better and more confident with experience. If a revision is suggested, again, make sure it's clear what revisions must be made for the paper to be acceptable, which revisions would really improve the quality of the paper, but maybe are not critical, and then what would be nice, and list them in that order. And again, if you are rejecting it, I would reiterate the reasons why it didn't fit the journal. The research design was faulty, or it was so poorly written, I really couldn't evaluate the paper very well. So don't just say I reject it, just, summarize the reason why, because you don't want to waste a lot of time. If you're going to reject the paper because you couldn't understand any of it, you don't need to write all these extensive notes. You can just say, unfortunately, these are the reasons I had to reject the paper. You want to focus on specific problems, but general solutions. And that's in both the evaluation for the editor and what comes next, which are the point-by-point suggestions for the authors. Again, in order of the most important to the least important. You want to be very specific about what the problems are. In paragraph 3 of the results, sentence 2, a p-value is missing. That needs to be added before we can accept the paper. If it's a recurring problem, give examples. Term X in this field should be term Y. In paragraph 1 of the introduction, sentence 3, here is an example of this error, where please use Y for X in the introduction and throughout the paper, so that the author has a very clear understanding with the example of exactly what you want changed, and then they can take that the rest of the way. In general, though, the correction should be general. Fix this, add citations. You're obviously not expected to be able to tell them what citations. Sometimes sometimes you're like, oh, I know that there's some new research out, please consider looking at what so-and-so's lab is doing. That would really boost your argument, help underline your premises. That's okay, but you are not in charge of fixing it. You're just in charge of evaluating it. Again, identify the corrections that must be made before you would accept that paper to be published. So now what have you got? You've got your summary of what you read. You've got your notes, 3 positive things, and a general summary of what you think needs to be corrected, and the corrections that need to be made for you to accept the paper. And you've listed very specific, in order of most severe to least critical, changes for the author to make. And you've all seen these, sometimes they're numbered. You can use whatever strategy you want. Some editors will go through and combine and give the authors one. I think, in my experience, most of them just kind of slap those in at the end, and reviewer 1, reviewer 2, reviewer 3, and some of them are, and then the author has to kind of go through and repeat those. So making sure that each recommendation is in one sentence, don't bunch 4 recommendations together, keep them separate in a point-by-point list is important. And so you've done all that. You've prepared your report, hit save, walk away. And then come back a couple days later, a week later, a month later, and read it again. You're going to look to see if any of your biases came through. And what I mean by bias is Sometimes it's just your frustration with a paper. Sometimes you're you just, it comes out more harshly than you expected it to. So you want to evaluate whether your comments are actually helpful, whether what you criticize there's a solution for, and that you've offered a general solution to fix it, or whether you're just nitpicking things that really can't be changed and don't, and importantly, don't really affect the value of the paper. Okay. So if you tend to be a critic, you want to be looking that way, looking to be more generous. And if you're more generous, you might want to make sure that you're not like, oh, I'm so excited, there's a paper on GM3 and the ganglioside GM3, and maybe willingly overlook things. And you also want to look at the quality of the professionalism of the writing. Would you speak that way to somebody if you were talking to them face to face? It's easy to get distracted. How do you stay focused? You get hung up on all the different ways you would have written the results differently. Take a step back, and that's where your summary comes in. By looking at that summary, okay, I'm just looking at the results. I'm just looking at they're relevant. I don't have to go, I don't have to get so in the weeds, right? Helps you pull back a little bit. Remember that you're here to promote the field and be encouraging. You want to go back to Gareth, the slide. That was what I was going to say. Sorry, I lost the point. You're not the only person making this decision. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about it. Sorry, Gareth, I was run slow. You can move ahead to the next one, please. Again, communicating professionally with the author is a great thing to practice, because you are writing emails and talking to people in language all the time. And particularly if you're talking to people where you don't share the same native language, things can come across more terse than you mean them to. So it's a good idea you can follow a few things that help with that. Avoid you language. You need to fix that, something like you're talking to your kids, sending them to bed, right? By eliminating you get rid of kind of that bossy voice. Also refer to problems with the paper, not the authors. The introduction is lacking citations. The method section is not fleshed out well enough to understand the experiments to the degree that I could repeat them. When you're giving your suggestions, you can use I language. I suggest the authors do this. If you slip and use you there, and it's a positive comment or a good suggestion, that's not critical, but particularly when you're identifying problems, stay away from using you and refer to the paper, not the authors. Again, it's kind of repeating, but it's important. Describe the problems fully. Don't say the introduction's lacking citations and then not tell them where. The second paragraph is lacking key citations that need to be added. So I give an example here. The introduction is incomplete because key citations are not included to support X, Y, and Z. Citations supporting X, Y, and Z are needed for this paper to be accepted. Very clear. Even if it's a little repetitive, it's very clear. Using examples and identifying them not only by cutting and pasting, but by identifying where they are in the paper is very helpful. There we go. We want to use standard subject verb construction. Just keep it short and simple. I tend to have a very, as you could probably tell by me talking, I have a very verbose writing style. And when I write blogs, I have to really work hard at shortening sentences to make them just really basic. Limit the number of the word ands and buts and commas. That's one just very superficial way of ensuring you don't have to count words, because sometimes there's lists, obviously you have to have commas, but kind of think about keeping it short and keeping subject first, then verb. Okay. Avoid pronouns. It's easy to slip into assuming the researcher is a he or a she. That's not good. But also avoid pronouns when referring back to the part of a paper. If you're talking about the introduction, don't refer it as this, rephrase introduction or restate that it's this paragraph so that that you're clear. Sometimes, in a whole paragraph, it's hard to remember what this is referring to. So even if it sounds repetitive, it's better to be clear and boring than, smoother but unclear. So some experiences that I've had, again, vague phrasing for the problem. The introduction is not logical. Okay, let's go back to our beginning of our webinar here. We talked about, is it not logical because it's not written properly, or is it not logical because the premise isn't supported? So you really need to identify exactly what the problem is. Yeah, it's not logical, but sometimes it's unclear whether it's because the author just needs an editor and can be corrected, or whether the premise is just not properly supported. The flip side of that is that the suggested revision is too precise. I'll tell you a little story. So I was the editor for a journal, and I also had access to the reviewer comments. And the reviewer told this editor to put all the letters in a figure in a certain font. The letters in figure 1 should be in 12-point New Roman font. But the reviewer wasn't really knowledgeable about the publication process, and this was back in the day of print. So not only did the author go back and put everything in the figure in 12-point font, I had to prepare the paper for production, and I had to take it all out. So we had the author doing too much work and me doing too much work. And that's the problem with being too precise. Sometimes the peer reviewer and trying to be helpful actually creates more work and more problems. So stay in your lane, make general. In a case like that would be, the figure's hard to read. Please make the letters smaller and more white space between the letters and the image. That's all you need to do. Let the author figure out how to fix that. Another problem I have run into is that the authors the reviewers want a lot more than can be delivered in this paper. Usually there's a time range, a time frame in which the authors have to send the paper back for the second round of reviews. They can't, identify another cohort of patients to assess, or, data to assess. So that you have to decide, does the paper merit worth on its own, and can be, and maybe the argument tightened up a little bit so that it can be resubmitted as this paper. If it absolutely needs more work than can be allotted in that amount of time, maybe the decision is a reject and ask them to resubmit a completely different paper. But do try to keep in mind that the authors have limitations on what they can do. And finally, low proficiency in a non-native language is an issue for all of us. We all try to communicate in a second language. That can be very difficult. It's perfectly okay for you to take your comments and ask a colleague to read them for tone and for readability. It's not okay to share the comments as they're in the papers. That information should be kept private. But again, use short sentences, avoid pronouns, and give examples. So even if your language isn't as crisp as it could be, if you give examples, that goes a long way to help clarify what you're asking for. So we want to review what the final structure looks like. We've got the paper summary is going to include your analysis, your initial thoughts, your summary of the premise, the hypothesis and research questions, the methods, findings, and relevance. This acts as a starting point from everybody to work on to make sure we're all on the same page of what paper we're talking about and what that paper was about. In the analysis summary, you're going to give your overall impression based on the notes that you took, including 3 positive comments about the paper if possible, and then addressing the problems with the most important first, the ones that would be nice, and the ones that, really are the final touches that could be added to make the paper that much better. You're going to precisely give your corrections, and you're precisely going to give your decision, whether you've accepted, revised, and resubmit, or rejected. And again, noting any caveats with that decision. As we talked about earlier, maybe, in the revise and resubmit, you have to put a note in there like, this can only be accepted if they have, an institutional review board license number that shows that they have followed certain procedures for their animal experiments. If that's not there, then the paper has to be rejected, even if it's really good. So those are notes to the editor, and the author will read these too, but that would what I mean by a caveat to the decision, that, you're assuming that they did that and that they have to put it in the paper. The point-by-point suggestions are the same way, precise in order of most important to least important. So the process looks like this. You read the paper for takeaways, you summarize the paper and make general notes. Then you focus on each section, keeping in mind the key things that journal editors are looking for, whether the premise is on, the validity, the reliability, the completeness, and the ethics. And I didn't have on there whether it meets the mission and vision of the journal. Incorporate the notes that you have to substantiate your general notes, and note the key errors in particularly, and then you're going to write the paragraph. Summarize the positives, summarize the negatives, and render your decision. List suggestions for authors, and again, be precise in the problem, general in the solution. And finally, you're going to put it away for a while and come back to it with fresh eyes and look to ensure that you have a professional tone, that the grammar is correct, and that there's no spelling errors. There's nothing worse than seeing someone criticize an author for misspellings in a paragraph with misspellings. So you want to make sure that, you've checked that yourself. Again, in summary, identify problems. I know we're kind of going over a lot of the same ground, but I think these are the big takeaways. Identify problems precisely and give examples to clarify. Identify the problems that must be fixed. Make general selections. In other words, stay in your lane. You're not there to tell them how their research design should look. If it's not right, it's not right. You can make some minor suggestions or to point them in a direction, but it's not, and this goes to time. You're not going to have time to do this, so you need to help stay focused on the big picture. Show professionalism and consider the tone. Think like a teacher, not a critic. It's easy when you're asked to review something and you're expected to give a critical analysis. It's easy to be too critical. And kindness is never the wrong way to go. And it's it's a skill you're going to need. If you're a professor or you're a head of a lab or you're doing whatever, you're going to have to deliver difficult information to people, and getting in the practice of doing that in a professional and collegial way is a real gift. It's a real skill, and people who do it well are pretty amazing. So it's a goal to strive for.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nancy. That was absolutely fantastic. We got lots and lots of questions from our audience members. We still have many, many people with us in the Zoom room. So if you're interested in getting in touch with us at Reviewer Credits, do click on the link here. Do join us. I've put the link several times, my own email address several times in the chat. Nancy, do you have a few moments to answer a few questions? Because we've gotten a number from our audience members. Are you free for a few more minutes?
I am, and I was when I got distracted, so I could see some of those questions popping up. So
yeah, we got millions of questions. It's been absolutely fantastic. People have been asking about certificates. Yes, everyone attending this gets a certificate. Everyone gets access to the recording of this event. So that is a common question that we've been asked. People also ask, does Reviewer Credits match journals to peer reviewers? Yes, if you sign up as a peer reviewer on Reviewer Credits, we will match you to journals. You'll get peer review requests from reputable journals. You don't have to worry about whether those journals are decent or not. So let's get into the questions. And we've got one from Faisal. Do reviewers check for plagiarism? While some journals lack an option to upload a review file, providing comments for the editor or authors, how can we handle this situation? Should the reviewer be checking for plagiarism, Nancy?
You might have a different opinion on this. I think if you suspect it, I think this might be a case where you would go back to the editor and talk to them. I would, it is not your responsibility to run some kind of program that shows plagiarism. If the journal has a desk editor, that may have already been done in their process, and it's a good question to ask the editor. Has this been checked for plagiarism? If you suspect it, I would make a note to the editor, but I would not seek out looking for it. If it's jumping in your face, like it's your paper, that's something, that's something different. But I don't think that that's your core responsibility. It would be part of the analysis. And if it's egregious, you might contact the editor even before you get too far in the review. So they in the editorial office can run that check. Is that how you would?
Yeah, this is something that's done. Well, if it's flagged by a peer reviewer, if you think that a paper that you're working on has potentially got some plagiarized content in it from other papers that you've worked on, from other papers that you've read, that if you flag that to the editorial office, they'll run it through Turnitin or Flag Scan or one of these other tools, because not every paper that gets submitted to a journal will be checked for plagiarism. So if you suspect it, absolutely flag it. So that's a great question. We have one from SH Wakar. How much statistical awareness is required for a peer reviewer? Nancy, it's a good question.
That's a great question. So this is probably, if you're a statistician in this group, get prepared, because your phone's going to be ringing off the hook, because that is probably the area where most authors and peer reviewers feel least adequate. I think awareness is the key term. I think understanding what elements of a particular analysis have to be reported, like p-values or confidence intervals. I think it's, do you have to know it cold? No, it's one of those things you have to sense that something's wrong and then look into it more deeply, either without bringing the whole paper, talking to a colleague, or something if you don't feel terribly confident. Because you will run into some statistics that you learned at one time you don't remember. So having an awareness of what a complete report looks like and what looks completely out of bounds, if the standard deviation is 5 times bigger than than what would be expected in a normal distribution, understanding, in other words, if the paper's in your field, you probably have more of an understanding than you think you do. But kind of the same thing, if something doesn't look right, flag it, and you can ask for some advice if you're not 100% confident. But you need to know what statistics are used in your field and the experiments and in the constructs in your field.
Yeah, many journals will have statistical experts who look at papers. If you're not familiar with the tools or the methods or the analyses being used in the paper that you're being asked to review, please say that to the editor, because you can still provide a very thorough, effective review, even though you're not a statistics expert. And they may want to get somebody in to look at the statistics in the paper. We've got lots of comments and questions about how many journals provide templates for peer review, like a checklist, for example. And people are asking, can I use what's been provided in this webinar as a backbone template for providing a more detailed evaluation of a paper? Yes, exactly. That's the reason that we did this. That's exactly the point. We've got another question about AI tools, Nancy. Are there any? Yeah.
Can I go back to the question with the template? Yes, you can absolutely use it. And you are going to find that you're going to, adjust things the way it works for you. Every reviewer looks at it differently. So I just want to kind of point out that you're going to develop your own method, but absolutely having a starting place to make sure that you've hit all the main points, the stuff in this presentation should allow you to do that. And then you can adjust how you want to ask the questions and in what order, in a way that makes sense to you. I'm sorry, Gareth, I think the question was on AI. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to jump in there.
Not at all. No, we've got millions of questions, so we'll have to follow up with many of the questions after the event, but like another of our colleagues asked whether there are any AI tools that could be used to help with peer review. What is your view on the use of AI tools to help with peer review, Nancy?
I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I am just becoming familiarized myself with AI. I think certainly certain kinds of sentences can be prompted by peer review, but the ideas still have to come from you. And so if you're going to use AI, I would use it for the more general things like, here, write a summary with these points in it. Make sure that those points are rendered the way you would want them to. So I guess I'm a little nervous about AI yet, but I think certainly any way that can help you write a sentence more clearly. But the content if you're going to use AI, you've got to go back and really make sure that what you intended to say is said.
Excellent. We got a question about whether a reviewer can see the final decision that gets made about a paper after they've done peer review. That is dependent on the journal. I mean, some journals will send you an email saying the paper that you worked on has now been accepted, or the paper that you worked on as a peer reviewer has now been sent back to the authors. It totally depends on the journal. Dixon, thank you so much for that. We're getting some really great comments, Nancy. Everyone's really happy with the presentation, so thank you so much once again. Is it acceptable to ask the editor for a copy of the comments made by other reviewers so that you can compare and learn from other reviewers? What do you think about that question? It's a great question.
That's come up before. In the experience I had, that was not allowed, because again, your input is what they're asking for. And we hear a lot about consensus in science, but the reality is you've been asked to be an expert based on your, and I want to say bias, but it's really your perspective. I understand the reason you want to do that. I would suggest that maybe a better way of handling that would be opening up some dialogues in chat rooms, at conferences, and not using specific examples for that. That's just that has been my experience, that the editors have not allowed that. And I think the reasoning for that is pretty sound. Now, Gareth might have a different experience, but
I agree completely. Like that's often the best way to go, to communicate with the editor, to talk to the editor. I know that we're over time, Nancy. Maybe you have time for just one or two more questions.
Sure.
We have a question again here, like if the author of a paper feels that a reviewer has not reviewed it properly, as an author, can you go back and complain? For example, if you've written a short comment that just summarizes research in a paper, can you as an author talk to the editor if you feel you've been treated unfairly?
Well, you can always complain, right? But yeah. I think usually in these cases there is an opportunity for the author to respond. So in fact, I've edited a lot of those responses, and I think it is okay to say as an author, I think it's okay to say, I think the reviewer might have misinterpreted what I was saying or whatever. I think it's just one thing to keep in mind is if you think the reviewer didn't understand something you said, and this is kind of painful to hear, it could be because you as the author didn't write it as clearly as you thought you did. So I think it's okay to point out what you intended to say and make your argument about why the reviewer was wrong. But I think it's to your advantage to also take responsibility of thinking, ooh, maybe the reviewer thought that way because I wasn't as clear as I could have been. And that response to the reviewer's suggestions is a way to do that. And if you're an author, you get to practice some of those same, how do I respond professionally? How do I show respect to the reviewer who has voluntarily taken their time to do this? But yeah, people make mistakes. Reviewers certainly make mistakes. And so I think it's okay. Some journals actually enable you to have your paper reevaluated later. The term's escaping me at the time. It's not a resubmission. It's basically asking for a rejudgment, asking for a reevaluation, and there's a specific term. And of course, as the editor, I cannot think of the word. But yeah, you can always more dialogue. I don't think ever hurts anybody. You know, I think asking questions, and I mean, complain. What can they say? No, we're not going to reevaluate it. You know, it's, you know, do you want to work with them anyway? Maybe not. Maybe that's a sign to move on to the next thing. So I would encourage you to always ask questions, especially today. You know, the worst that can happen is they don't respond. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
it's if the editors I have worked with and the peer reviewers that I have worked with, they are there because they want to help authors. So even if your paper was rejected, I would consider asking. You probably can't get access to the peer reviewer, but talking to the editor about what could I have done differently, or how would you approach this differently? Having a basis, a point of reference to go to a more experienced author. I'm a firm believer in more good dialogue and not, you know,
100%. Yeah, communicate. Absolutely. Talk to
yeah.
your editors, talk to your peer reviewers, talk to Nancy. Nancy's email address is here on the screen. Nancy's website is here on the screen. We're very grateful to you, Nancy, for joining us for this event this evening. We've taken up way too much of your time, but thank you everybody for joining. We got a record number of participants for this Reviewer Credits webinar. We got a record number of questions, many of which we've been unable to even get to. So we'll come back with questions, responses, content. Everyone gets a certificate. Everyone will get a recording of this fantastic event. Nancy, again, like, do take a screenshot of this, write down Nancy's email, drop her a line. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. And, you know, thank you all for your interest in peer review. You are desperately needed.
And with that, we'll say thank you, everybody. Have a good day, have a good evening, and see you in our next Reviewer Credits event. Join us on reviewercredits.com if you haven't already, and sign up for our newsletter and sign up as a peer reviewer. Good day, and thank you once again for attending.